So I'm just going to jump right into it. I was just got it. So before I got cut off, I was just speaking about what will be covered during the presentation. So to contextualize today's presentation, really get a sense of the experiences of transgender and gender diverse people who are in incarceration, we're briefly going to look at the experiences or the research that has been done primarily in the US. That is where we're getting most of the incarceration research compared to other countries. And from research, we know that at least 16% of adults transgender individuals have been incarcerated compared to the 2.7% of the general population. And that is quite a big difference. Further, we know that 1 out of 6 transgender people in general have had contact with the criminal justice system. And what we're seeing in research is that for African people of color are among the vulnerable population due to multiple and intersecting discrimination such as transphobia, racism, and classism. So this is all about generally the statistics around that. But what we're actually seeing in the US, and it's starting to happen quite globally as well, is that we are seeing the policing of sexual and gender minorities. And it is enforced through the regulations and ordinances implemented throughout the state. For an example, I'm going to be looking more at the information from the states. And this is reflected in this overrepresentation of sexual and gender minorities in correctional facilities. What we're seeing again is this harsher punishment for sexual and gender minorities compared to their heterosexual counterparts. We know that usually these individuals or this class of individuals receive harsher sentences than their counterparts. It's not something that we're seeing happening in South Africa and perhaps in other African countries, but it's definitely something that's been recorded in the States. And this speaks to the biased nature then of the criminal justice system through the implementation of punitive laws for sexual and gender minorities who are in conflict with the law. We in the States, they have this strategy called the quality of life policing strategy. And research has shown that this kind of strategy, in a way, has targeted a lot of sexual and gender minorities. For example, Goldberg notes that most sexual minorities can be disproportionately affected by the enforcement of this strategy. For example, sexual and gender diverse young people who are homeless and who are not feeling safe at home and supportive, they may spend most of their time congregating in public spaces where they are connecting with peers. And this then may put them in harm's way or at risk of being criminalized because of this quality of life policing strategies. But then what is happening in Africa? So a lot of this I got when I was doing my PhD. We do know that in Africa, there is relative silence. There's a lot of silence when it comes to incarceration studies, specifically when it comes to the incarceration of sexual and gender minorities. Most African countries have taken this role, or they've taken this perspective that, gay and bisexual and transgender people don't exist in their countries. Therefore, studying them and, writing papers on them, of those individuals would be saying we acknowledge that we have individuals who are LGBTQI in our countries. So we know that's why there's ample literature on the targeting of sexual and gender minorities by laws in the United States. In Africa, there is relative academic and research silence on this issue. What has been largely documented, though, is the vulnerable and disadvantaged position that is held by sexual and gender diverse people in relation to the criminal justice system in many African countries. For example, if you think about studies by Amusan and Arimaro and Izukba and Maeka, they speak about this disenfranchised and this very position that sexual and gender minorities in the African continent face. We know that recently in Uganda, for an example, Parliament passed a sweeping anti-gay bill that further criminalizes LGBT people and imposes a death penalty for sexually active gay men and lesbian women. So some of those laws that we're seeing in Africa that are being implemented in most African countries are diverse people are often neglected. And for a long time, especially focusing in South Africa, for a long time, there has been focus on individuals who are gay or who are lesbian, and to an extent, individuals who are bisexual. But there's been a relative silence of individuals who identify as transgender or gender diverse. And you know that compared to other sexual minorities, transgender offenders face uh, are considered a more vulnerable population due to the heightened risk of victimization. Again, the argument is that because they are very visible and people can identify them, that's why they experience more victimization compared to other groups that might be able to conceal their identities. Unlike sexually diverse offenders, transgender and gender diverse offenders also present with special needs. For example, we're going to speak about secure placement or housing, search procedures, and definitely access to gender-affirming healthcare services. Correctional institutions and gender and sex classification. And so we're going to look at five major factors. What are these five major factors? And I think I wrote about these five major factors. I think three of them I wrote about them in the Southern African HIV Clinician Society guidelines, but we're going to look at all the factors today. So some of those factors then, it's classification, placement in housing, access to gender-affirming healthcare, victimization, and denial of gender expression. Now, if we look at classification, this process then marks the beginning of the humiliation journey for the majority of transgender and gender diverse offenders who enter the system. This process involves offenders being strip searched in the presence of correctional officials and other offenders for security purposes, checking for possible concealed contraband. We know that some of the practices in correctional facilities that people will conceal contraband like drugs and maybe cell phones in their anal cavities. So this then process is about determining, and sometimes this process of strip searching them then becomes a sort of like a search determining their gender by inspecting their genitalia. And studies and first individual reports show us that this practice is excruciatingly humiliating, especially for transgender women, for example, who are on feminizing hormones but still have their primary sex organs. Strip searches can be experienced as traumatic by transgender individuals, especially when they are carried out by officials of a different gender, or when the individual's genitalia are being exposed for the sole purposes of degradation and humiliation. And we see that happening in these spaces. Now, if we think about placement and housing, correctional facilities across the world, then we know they are segregated along the lines of sex. Therefore, offenders then are housed according to their sex assigned at birth. We know that all biologically male offenders will be housed in a male-only institution, and biologically female offenders will be housed in a female-only institution. Now, this means that transgender women who have not fully transitioned are housed in an all-male correctional facility. The same applies for transgender men as well. But because of their visibility, transgender and gender diverse, lesbian and gay, and sometimes bisexual offenders are at high risk of discrimination and physical and sexual violence. So what happens in many countries, again, modeling it on the US, for example, and we've seen this in South Africa, we've started doing the same thing. In order to protect these individuals, then they are housed in protective custody or protective section. But we do know from research, and what I've also discovered in my own study, that while these sections provide safety from violence perpetrated by other offenders in the general sections or communal sections, sometimes they do function to isolate transgender and gender diverse offenders, as well as other LGBT or LGB offenders, thereby placing them at a greater risk of victimization by officials. And then if we think about access then to gender health care, to gender-affirming healthcare services, again, this gender binary system, this is operating in correctional facilities, the transphobic attitude of correctional staff, as well as the lack of information about transgender and gender diverse people significantly contributes to the access to gender-affirming healthcare services by transgender and gender diverse offenders. Denial of necessary gender-affirming healthcare services in many studies, has been linked to many adverse health and mental health outcomes. A denial of these healthcare services possibly leads to the worsening of its, for example, mental illnesses such as depression, self-injury, and suicide. And an interesting study by Bromdahl and colleagues in 2018 actually revealed that transgender offenders who are denied gender-affirming healthcare may engage in what they call self-treatment or auto-castration. And I listed a very disturbing or touching example of this in my thesis, where a transgender individual mutilated her genitals because they've been denied access to affirming healthcare. So individuals may then engage in auto-castration in an attempt to deal with the discomfort associated with gender dysphoria. For those, we're not saying that all of those individuals who experience gender dysphoria, but for those who experience gender dysphoria, they might engage in those very dangerous and sometimes life-threatening behaviors. And as I've said previously, victimization, again, a number of studies have highlighted the victimization of transgender, especially of transgender individuals in correctional facilities. These range from verbal abuse to physical abuse to sexual abuse. And if you think about South African correctional facilities in particular, we have this interesting notion of prison marriages where people then engage in a way forced marriages or forced prison marriages with a gang member because of their own safety. They are promised safety when they enter. If you get into a relationship with me, I'm going to protect you, but you're going to have to provide sexual favors. In broader literature, in international literature, this has been seen as protective pairing. And again, one of the big ones, the denial of gender expression. We know in South Africa, and we're going to speak about this a bit later on, the case of Jade September, a transgender offender in the Western Cape, who took the department to court because then she was denied gender expression. And again, reflecting on my own study, I saw about 2 transgender women in 2 of the correctional facilities that I did my data collection in. And the general experiences is being denied their right to express their gender identity. And obviously that comes in different ways, such as misgendering, dead naming, and all those experiences. So the question then is, are there any initiatives? So we know all these things are happening in correctional facilities, and I'm not going to speak about initiatives in other countries, but in South Africa, are there initiatives by the Department of Correctional Services to try and manage, and I'm using the term or the word manage here very cautiously, but again, working in this system is how we really relate to people, especially individuals who are offenders. Now again, for grounding the initiatives, we're looking at the experience in the case of Jade September, who took the department to court. The matter was eventually heard in the Equality Court, and fortunately, Ms. September won the case. And the court made a number of rulings against the Department of Correctional Services. For example, they were to return her articles such as clothing and jewelry. The department was ordered to address her using her and using the name that she preferred using, which is Jade September. The biggest aspect of that was the court ordering then the department to institute training for all existing and new correctional officials on issues of offenders who identify as LGBTQI. Again, we did have another case in Johannesburg, Medium B, in a gay offender who took the department to court. And again, well, fortunately, the court sided with him. So what did this spark then for the Department of Correctional Services? So this sort of like propelled the department to then develop what we call the SOP on the management of LGBTQIA offenders. So the SOP, the Standard Operating Procedure. I suppose the one biggest complaint that we got from a number of stakeholders who are key players in this field was there was lack of consultation, obviously, and it seemed like it was a very haphazard job by the department. However, it did pave a way for the department to effectively and positively respond to individuals who identify as transgender and LGB in our facilities. So again, the SOP is to ensure that DCS officials at all levels provide a service that is professional, non-judgmental, non-marginalizing towards LGBTQIA individuals, their families, their friends, and their support networks, to ensure the protection of LGBTQI persons who are victims of crime and the prevention of secondary victimization. And this one largely speaks to the experiences that these individuals go through in correctional facilities, such as being raped, for example, or physically or verbally abused by either correctional officials or other inmates. To ensure the protection of the constitutional rights of LGBTQIA individuals who are alleged who are alleged perpetrators of crime. So those become the main pillars then of the standard operating procedures. Now, it is nested in a number of regulatory frameworks. I'm not going to go into that. It's not really important for our presentation. But in drawing up this SOP, whoever was responsible for drawing it up, they looked at a number of local and international regulatory framework. For example, the international one looking at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, looking at the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, or most people who know them as Mandela rules, looking at the relevant local and international, looking at the local mandates, for example, the Constitution being the cornerstone of the SOP, the Correctional Services Act, which is quite interesting, and I've argued this point, is that the Correctional Services Act is very silent about individuals who identify as sexual and gender diverse. It speaks about other vulnerable groups such as, the juvenile offenders, mothers with children, offenders living with a certain disability or mental illness, but it has been quite silent about individuals who identify as sexual and gender diverse. And the hope is eventually it's going to be revised to include that group as a vulnerable group. It looks at the white paper on corrections. I'm not going to go through all of those. So what does it speak to then? It's a lengthy SOP, so I'm just gonna look at the important aspects. It looks at communication. So how do officials then communicate with LGBTQI individuals or transgender individuals in this case? How do we as officials then practice the respect and the protection of offenders' dignity? How do we act with integrity when conducting the business of the state or the business of the department? How do we use language? And we know that in correctional facilities and I suppose in other areas of the community as well, people are used to using very offensive very humiliating and degrading language when it comes to individuals who are sexual and gender minorities. So how do we then use the correct language in these facilities? How do we use people's preferred names? And I might be shot down for say preferred names, but how do we use people's names as they want us to use? How do we refer to people? How to use pronouns? How do we then how do we practice confidentiality when a person has, confided in us as officials? Issues of privacy, and definitely issues of behavior of officials and other offenders as well, and education. And education is when then I have come in quite largely in terms of the training of correctional officials on the management of individuals who identify as LGBTQI. Obviously, the training is modeled on the SOP, but again, bringing in the knowledge that I have in the area as well. So what are some of the resolutions? And I'm going to call them resolutions at the lack of a better word. So what are some of the things that were then suggested or proposed by the SOP? Now, if we're looking at such procedures, because the SOP was trying to target the most sensitive areas that officials need to be cognizant of. When you're looking at the search procedures for LGBTI and particularly for transgender individuals, it says transgender persons should not be subjected to unnecessary undressing, and officials must refrain from removing wigs and prosthetics unless the removal is required for the purposes of the searching of the individual. And again, this extends to taking away people's jewelry, for an example, people's earrings, people's clothing, female clothing. And the SOP says officials cannot remove those items unless they can, state it was removed for the purposes of searching, and they can show evidence for that. The removed items then should be returned to the person unless it cannot be returned for the safety of the individual. Again, it looks at the body cavity, rectal or pelvic examinations. Body cavity searches are not to be ordered as a manner of routine screening as it was done previously, but they are only to be undertaken if there's a reasonable suspicion in individual cases. So we're trying to move away from conducting these routine searches as means of degrading and humiliating people and trying to show other people, other offenders, that this individual is biologically a man, even though they identify as female. A search entailing the physical problem of the body must now be strictly undertaken by a medical official or practitioner that is either a medical doctor or a nurse or suitably trained or authorized registered nurse. We look at then at the accommodation for the different categories. So inmates who are LGBTQI then must be separated from other inmates. They must be detained separately. Transgender males should be then detained together, and transgender females then should be detained together for the purposes of safety. We're going to look later on. We're going to look at housing and how do we then work through that issue. So, I mean, something is happening, which is a positive thing, and we've seen it happening at the ground level. I suppose one of the challenges is that I have been very involved in this training and in doing this sensitization in my management area or in the larger prisons I'm working in, and in the neighboring prison, Modabi in Benoni. However, we're seeing most of these things happening a lot at the ground root level. We're not seeing anything happening at regional level or at national level. The SOP was drafted and circulated, to high-ranking officials, as nothing was done after that. So we have tried in my management area to sort of like bring the SOP to individuals in the ground level who are actually working with transgender and gender diverse as well as other LGBT individuals. But what is happening in reality? What is actually happening? So what I uncovered in my study, 2023, as well as other studies that have been done, particularly in the US, but I'm going to focus on my study. Still, we are seeing purposeful misgendering by correctional officials. So the transgender participants expressed that the officials, knowing how they want to be referred to, and having heard that over and over again, will purposefully misgender them to prove a particular point, that this is an all-male correctional facility. Definitely denial of gender expression. So one of the participants said, in my cell and in my small section, I'm allowed to wear a dress that I've made out of, the correctional material that they are provided with. However, the minute I step out of my section and have to maybe go to the psychologist or the social worker, or I need to go and attend programs, I need to wear pants, I need to wear trousers, I need to behave like a man, because this is an all-male facility. And definitely no access to gender-affirming healthcare. So one of the participants had actually started the process of requesting that they should be referred to an outside public hospital so they can be started on hormones. And this then became a back and forth process between them going to see the GP, then being referred to a psychiatrist, then being referred to a psychologist, then being referred to a social worker, then back to the hospital section. So it sounds as if people don't really know what to do when it comes to providing gender-affirming healthcare. It's either the people don't know what to do, or there's a lot of ignorance around that issue. We do know from research that gender-affirming health, especially in carceral or correctional spaces, is still seen as largely cosmetic and not an essential. Placement, again, there seems to be no place for gender and diverse, for transgender and gender diverse people in prison. And this is interesting because we're looking at two separate housing or accommodation spaces. We're looking at the communal cells where all the offenders are kept. And then we're looking at the protective sections where vulnerable offenders are kept. This would be your LGBTQI offenders. This would be your judges, your magistrates, your lawyers, your prosecutors. However, the experiences people are having, or at least my participants are having, is that we don't have a place because we don't fit in communal sections, because we are at risk of being victimized and sexually victimized by other offenders. But when it comes to protective sections, then we have been victimized by a correctional official, so we don't know where do we fit in this larger space. So what can we do then? Is there something that DCS can do? As I said, with the gazetting of the SOP, this was a very first and positive move by the department. But can we do more? And definitely we can do more, and definitely we should do more, because we are seeing a growing trend where we're seeing transgender individuals coming into correctional facilities. This is not obviously a good trend, and it has nothing to do with their gender identity, but they're coming into facilities, because they've committed crime in society. And as a department, we cannot just ignore that aspect. We have to measure in order for us to protect and afford the constitutional rights of individuals who identify as LGBTQI. So I'm going to look at the recommendations that, number one, I made in my thesis, but also the recommendations are made in the Gender Affirming Healthcare Guidelines by the HIV Clinician Society. And the first one is looking at housing. And it is important to ensure safe and secure detention and incarceration with appropriate section placement to reduce victimization. That is one thing. Transgender and gender diverse offenders should be assigned to a single cell. We know there might be challenges with regards to that because of overcrowding in Gauteng. But again, they should be assigned to a single cell if this is their preference. But it is also important to recognize, as I've mentioned before, that protective placement may in itself result in victimization. So safe and secure detention and incarceration of transgender then offenders starts with the appropriate section or housing placement unit. This will then definitely reduce victimization. We have spoken about in South Africa what we are doing in South Africa, that we have the protective sections. However, again, we need to be cognizant of the need that transgender offenders are not a homogeneous group. While some may feel safe in the protective sections, others might prefer to be placed in a communal cell. I had in my study an individual, well, he identified as gay, but he did not want to be placed in a protective section. He said, I feel comfortable in a communal cell. I can identify with people there. I have people who are protecting me there. So the important is that we afford people the right to choose where they want to be placed instead of dictating where they need to be placed. So I've spoken about the victimization. It is then recommended that correctional administrators assess transgender offenders' preferences in terms of placement, where appropriate and safe. Transgender and gender of diverse offenders' autonomy with regard to placement should be respected and facilitated. But again, in cases where it can be foreseen this placement in a communal cell will then result in victimization, that information then should be communicated to individuals in a respectful manner. While some of my participants strongly felt that were angry about being placed in a protective section, some of the anger, or most of the anger, was not about being placed in that section per se, but some of the frustration was about the department dictating where they should be placed without any appropriate consultation. Definitely access to gender-affirming healthcare services. Obviously, we don't have, because hospitals, we have what you call hospitals in our sections, but really they're just small clinics with a few nurses and a psychiatrist and a doctor who come in once in a while or once in a blue moon. So at this point, we don't have the capacity then to provide gender-affirming healthcare. However, that doesn't mean that there's nothing that can be done. It is recommended that these correctional institutions facilitate and support transgender and gender diverse offenders in accessing gender-affirming healthcare by streamlining their procedures. An example of such streamlining then would be to allow and capacitate qualified in-house healthcare providers, including mental health care practitioners, to evaluate transgender offenders to determine their treatment needs. And this is very important, not to determine whether they need or whether they deserve treatment or not, but to evaluate their needs. What happens then after they receive treatment? Or gender-affirming healthcare, what kind of support are they going to need? Again, then this will make the process of accessing gender-affirming healthcare easier for those who started treatment prior to incarceration. So yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that. And definitely the big one, which was one of the point that most of the participants in my study raised, was the training of correctional officials. And there's definitely all existing and all new correctional officials should undergo some form of sensitivity training or information session, any kind of training. This is going to capacitate them on how do we work with individuals who identify as transgender. What are their needs? The issues of pronouns, the issues of using appropriate gender when referring to the individual is very, very important. What was quite interesting in my training, and I must have trained over 50 correctional officials between the two prisons that I have been doing the training, and what stunned me was in one session where this very elderly gentleman close to his retirement, a black official, who then came up to me and said, you know what, I have been harboring this very negative and perceptions towards individuals who identify as LGBTQI for all of my life because of how I was raised and socialized and what I was taught in church. And he said, but this kind of training has really opened my eyes. This kind of training has really capacitated me with knowledge and information of how do I then approach individuals who identify as LGBTQI. Interesting enough, he was working in a special care section. So that then that attests to the importance and the significance and probably the effectiveness doing training of correctional staff. However, as I said, this has been, to my knowledge, something that has been happening in my prison, in Moda B, while in other prisons, the training has been offered by HRD, and the only thing that people have been trained on is just legislation. And we do know that telling people about legislation and what they should be doing is not enough to capacitate them and give them more information about how to work with or manage individuals who are transgender. A study by Savillas and Janet in 2017, actually the results of their study showed that training interventions that transgender and gender diverse specific training equipped participants with the required cultural competence to provide gender-affirming healthcare for transgender and gender-diverse offenders. So then indeed, educational efforts to increase healthcare providers with cultural competence have proved successful in improving providers' understanding and knowledge relating to transgender and gender-diverse offenders. And again, finally, the effectiveness then of the implementation of the SOP, and I've mentioned this earlier on, is that the SOP was drafted in national office and sort of like, sent out to regional office and then management areas, to the area commissioners. But that is where most of this information ended up. It's then became stored in the area commissioners' offices or in the regional commissioners' offices or in those high-ranking officials' offices. But those individuals are not the individuals who work on the ground and who work with these offenders on a daily basis. So how do we then ensure that this is effectively implemented? And one aspect of that is to bring the SOP to the center level, to bring the SOP to individuals who work directly with transgender individuals, and not just give them the SOP to go and read. Because if you look at that document, it's a skeleton document. But then providing effective training that is, in my view, provided by an individual who has some idea about, LGBTQI plus individuals. And I suppose this will bring about a lot of difference to how correctional officials then conduct themselves and how they manage individuals who identify as transgender and gender diverse. Yeah, this brings me to the end of my presentation.